Introduction. I have one despectively simple and somewhat selfish goal for this book. I desperately want to share everything I've learned with you. I want to take my 2 decades of research and my experiences inside hundreds of organizations to give you a practical, no BS, actionable book about what it takes to be a daring leader. I say despectively simple because the data informing what presented in this book are the culmination of interview data collected over the past 20 years, new research including interviews with 150 global C-level and C-level leaders on the future of leadership, program evaluation research from our Brave Leaders Inc. Courage Building work, data collected during a 3-year instrument development study on daring leadership. Coding and making sense of 400,000 pieces of data is already complex, and the more committed I am to translating the data into actionable research-based practices, the more painstakingly precise I need to be with the data, and the more testing I need to do. The selfish part of my goal stems from wanting to be a better leader myself. Over the past 5 years, I've transitioned from research professor to research professor and founder and CEO. The first hard and humbling lesson, regardless of the complexity of the concepts, studying leadership is way easier than leading. When I think about my personal experiences with leading over the past few years, the only endeavors that have required the same level of self-awareness and equally high-level comms plan are being married for 24 years and parenting. And that's saying something. I completely underestimated the pull on my emotional bandwidth, the sheer determination it takes to stay calm under pressure, and the weight of continuous problem solving and decision making. Oh yeah, and the sleepless nights. My other quasi-selfish goal is this. I want to live in a world with braver border leaders, and I want to be able to pass that kind of world on to my children. I define a leader as anyone who takes responsibility for finding the potential in people and processes, and who has the courage to develop that potential. From corporation, nonprofits, and public sector organizations to governments, activist groups, schools, and faith communities, we desperately need more leaders who are committed to courageous, wholehearted leadership, and who are self-aware enough to lead from their hearts, rather than unevolved leaders who lead from hurt and fear. We've got a lot of ground to cover, and I told Steve that I wanted to write a book that would change how the reader thinks about leading, would result in at least one meaningful behavior change, and could be read cover to cover in one flight. He laughed and asked, Houston to Singapore? He knows that the longest flight I've ever endured, Moscow, was just halfway. I smiled and said no, New York to LA, with a short delay. Brave leaders encourage cultures. I've always been told, write what you need to read. What I need as a leader, and what every leader I've worked with over the past several years has asked for, is a practical playbook for putting the lessons from daring greatly and rising strong into action. There are even a few learning from braving the wilderness and can help us create a culture of belonging at work. If you read these books, expect some familiar lessons with new context, stories, tools, and examples related to our work lives. If you haven't read these books, no problem. I'll cover everything you need to know. The language, tools, and skills described in these chapters require courage and serious practice. Yet they are straightforward and, I believe, accessible and actionable to everyone holding this book. The barriers and obstacles to daring leadership are real and sometimes fierce. But what I've learned from both the research and my own life is that as long as we name them, stay curious, and keep showing up, they don't have the power to stop us from being brave. We've built a Dare to Lead hub on BrienneBrown.com, where you can find resources including a free downloadable workbook for anyone who wants to put this book further into action as you read. I highly recommend it. As we learned from the research we did for Rising Strong, we know that the way to move information from your head to your heart is through your hands. There are also leadership book recommendation and role play videos that you can watch as part of building your own courage skills. The video won't take the place of putting this book into practice, but they will give you some idea of what it can look like, of where it gets hard, and of how to circle back when you get inevitable make a mistake. Additionally, you will find a downloadable glossary of the language, tools, and skills that I'm discussing in the book. Terms included in the glossary are bolded throughout the book. What stands in the way becomes a way. We started our interviews with senior leaders with one question. What, if anything, about the way people are leading today needs to change in order for leaders to be successful in a complex, rapidly changing environment where we are faced with seemingly intractable challenges and an insatiable demand for innovation? There was one answer across the interviews. We need braver leaders and more courageous cultures. When we followed up to understand the specific why behind the call for braver leadership, the research took a critical turn. There wasn't just one answer, there were close to 50 answers, and many of them were intuitively connected to courage. Leaders talked about everything from critical thinking and the ability to synthesize and analyze information to building trust, rethinking educational system, inspiring innovation, finding common political ground amid growing polarization, making tough decisions, and the importance of empathy and relationship building in the context of machine learning and artificial intelligence. We keep peeling the metaphorical onion by asking, can you break down the specific skills that you believe underpin brave leadership? I was surprised by how much the research participants struggled to answer this question. Just under half of the leaders we interviewed initially talked about courage as a personality trait, not a skill. They typically approach the question about specific skills with a, well, you either have it or you don't answer. We stayed curious and kept pushing for observable behaviors. What does it look like if you have it? Just over 80% of the leaders, including those who believed that courage is behavioral, couldn't identify the specific skills. However, they could immediately and passionately talk about problematic behaviors and cultural norms that corrode trust and courage. Luckily, the idea of starting where people are is a tenet of both grounded theory research and social work, and it's exactly what I do. As much time as I spend trying to understand the way, I spend 10 times as much researching what gets in the way. For example, I didn't set out to study shame. I wanted to understand connection and empathy. But if you don't understand how shame can unravel connection in a split second, you don't really get connection. I didn't set out to study vulnerability. It just happens to be the big barrier to almost everything we want from our lives, especially courage. As Marcus Aurelius taught us, what stands in the way becomes the way. Here are the 10 behaviors and culture issues that leaders identified as getting in our way in organizations across the world. 1. We avoid tough conversation, including giving honest, productive feedback. Some leaders attribute to this to a lack of courage, others to a lack of skills, and shockingly, more than half talked about cultural norm of nice and polite. That's leveraged as an excuse to avoid tough conversation. Whatever the reason, there was saturation across the data that the consequences is a lack of clarity, diminishing trust and engagement, and an increase in problematic behavior, including passive-aggressive behavior, talking behind people's backs, pervasive back-channel communication, or the meeting after the meeting, gossip, and the dirty yes, when I say yes to your face and then no behind your back. Rather than spending a reasonable amount of time proactively acknowledging and addressing the fears and feelings that show up during change and upheaval, We spend a reasonable amount of time managing problematic behaviors. 3. Diminishing trust caused by a lack of connection and empathy. 4. Not enough people are taking smart risks or creating and sharing bold ideas to meet changing demands and the insatiable need for innovation. When people are afraid of being put down or ridiculed for trying something and failing, or even for putting forward a radical new idea, the best you can expect is status quo and groupthink. 5. We get stuck and defined by setbacks, disappointments, and failures. So instead of spending resources on clean up to ensure that consumers, stakeholders, or internal processes are made whole, we are spending too much time and energy reassuring team members who are questioning their contribution and value. 6. Too much shame and blame, not enough accountability and learning. People are opting out of vital conversation about diversity and inclusivity because they fear looking wrong, saying something wrong or being wrong. Choosing our own comfort over hard conversation is the epitome of privilege, and it corrodes trust and moves us away from meaningful and lasting change. When something goes wrong, individuals and teams are rushing into ineffective or unsustainable solutions rather than staying with the problem identification and solving. When we fix the wrong thing for the wrong reason, the same problems continue to surface. It's costly and demoralizing. 9. Organizational values are gauzy and assessed in terms of aspiration rather than actual behaviors that can be taught, measured, and evaluated. 10. Perfectionism and fear are keeping people from learning and growing. I think most of us can look at this list and quickly recognize not only the challenges in our organizations, but our own internal struggles to show up and lead through discomfort. These may be work behaviors and organizational culture concerns, but what underlies all of them are deeply human issues. After finding the roadblocks, our job was to identify the specific courage-building skill sets that people need to address these problems. We conducted more interviews, developed instruments, and tested them with MBA and EMBA students enrolled at the Jones Graduate School of Business at Rice University, the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University, and the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. We worked until we found the answers. Then we tested it, improved it, and tested it again. Let's unpack what we learned. The heart of daring leadership. 1. You can't get to courage without rumbling with vulnerability. Embrace the suck. At the end of daring leadership is a deeply human truth that is rarely acknowledged, especially at work. Courage and fear are not mutually exclusive. Most of us feel brave and afraid at the exact same time. We feel vulnerable sometimes all day long during those in the arena moments that Roosevelt described when we're pulled between our fear and our call to courage. We need shared language, skills, tools, and daily practices that can support us through the rumble. The word rumble has become more than just a weird West Side Story way to say, let's have a real conversation. Even if it's tough, it became a serious intention and behavioral cue or reminder. A rumble is a discussion, conversation, or meeting defined by a commitment to lean into vulnerability, to stay curious and generous, to stick with the messy middle of the problem identification and solving, to take a break and circle back when necessary, to be fearless in owning our parts, and, as psychologist Harriet Lerner teaches, to learn with the same passion with which we want to be heard. More than anything else, when someone says, let's rumble, it cues me to show up with an open heart and mind so we can serve the work and each other, not our egos. Our research led to a very clear, very hopeful finding. Courage is a collection of 4 skills sets that can be taught, observed, and measured. The 4 skill sets are rumbling with vulnerability, living into our values, braving trust, learning to rise. The foundational skills of courage building is the willingness and ability to rumble with vulnerability. Without this core skill, the other three skill sets are impossible to put into practice. Consider this carefully. Our ability to be daring leaders will never be greater than our capacity for vulnerability. Once we start to build vulnerability skills, we can start to develop the other skill sets. The goal of this book is to give you language and specifics on the tools, practices, and behaviors that are critical for building the muscle memory for living these concepts. We've now tested this approach in more than 50 organizations and with approximately 10,000 individuals who are learning these skills on their own or in teams. From the Gates Foundation to Shell, from small family-owned businesses to Fortune 50 companies, to multiple branches of the U.S. military, we have found this process to have significant positive impact, not just on the way leaders show up with their teams, but also on how their teams perform. 2. Self-awareness and self-love matter. Who we are is how we lead. So often we think of courage as an inherent trait. However, it is less about who people are and more about how they behave and show up in difficult situations. Fear is the emotion at the center of that list of problematic behaviors and cultural issues. It's precisely what you'd expect to find as the underlying barrier to courage. However, all of the daring leaders we interviewed talked about experiencing many types of fear on a regular basis, which means the feeling fear is not the barrier. The true underlying obstacle to brave leadership is how we respond to our fear. The real barrier to daring leadership is armor, the thoughts, emotions, and behaviors that we use to protect ourselves when we aren't willing and able to rumble with vulnerability. While we will learn tools and build skills in the following chapters, we'll also access what gets in the way of building courage, especially when we can expect our armor to show up and pose resistance to new ways of doing things and new ways of being. Practicing self-compassion and having patience with ourselves are essential in this process. 3. Courage is contagious. To scale during leadership and build courage in teams and organizations, we have to cultivate a culture in which brave work, tough conversation, and whole hearts are the expectation, and armor is not necessary or rewarded. If we want people to fully show up, to bring their whole selves, including their unarmored whole hearts, so that we can innovate, solve problems, and serve people, we have to be vigilant about creating a culture in which people feel safe, seen, heard, and respected. Daring leaders must care for and be connected to people they lead. The data made clear that care and connection are irreducible requirements for wholehearted, productive relationships between leaders and team members. This means that if we do not have a sense of caring towards someone we lead and or we don't feel connected to that person, we have two options. To develop the caring and connection of find a leader who's a better fit. There's no shame in this. We've all experienced the kind of disconnection that doesn't get better despite our strongest efforts. Understanding that commitment to care and connection is the minimum threshold, we need real courage to recognize when we can't fully serve the people we lead. Given the reality of the world we live in today, that means leaders, you and I, must create and hold spaces that rise to a higher standard of behaviors than what we experience in the news, on TV, and in the streets. And for many, the culture at work may even need to be better than what they experience in their own home. Sometimes leaders' strategies makes us better partners and parents. As I often tell teachers, some of our most important leaders, we can't always ask our students to take off their armor at home or even on their way to school because their emotional and physical safety may require self-protection. But what we can do and what we are ethically called to do is create a space in our school and classrooms where all students can walk in and for that day or hour take off the crushing weight of their armor, hang it on a rack, and open their heart to truly being seen. We must be guardians of a space that allows students to breathe and be curious and explore the world and be who they are without suffocation. They deserve one place where they can rumble with vulnerability and their hearts can exhale. And what I know from the research is that we should never underestimate the benefit to a child of having a place to belong, even one where they can take off their armor. It can and often does change the trajectory of their life. If the culture to our school or organization's place of worship or even family requires armor because of issues like racism, classism, sexism, or any manifestation of fear-based leadership, we can't expect wholehearted engagement. Likewise, when our organizations reward armoring behaviors like blaming, shaming, cynicism, perfectionism, and emotional stoicism, we can't expect innovative work. You can't fully grow and contribute behind armor. It takes a massive amount of energy just to carry it around. Sometimes it takes all of our energy. The most powerful part of this process for us was seeing a list of behaviors emerge that are not hardwired. Everything above is teachable, observable, and measurable. Whether you're 14 or 40, for the research participant who were initially convinced that courage is determined by genetic destiny, the interview process alone proved to be a catalyst for change. One leader told me, "I'm in my late 50s, and it wasn't until today that I realized I was taught every single one of these behaviors growing up by either my parents or my coaches. When I get down to the nitty gritty, I can almost remember each lesson, how and when I learned it. We could and should be teaching this to everyone." This conversation was an important reminder to me that time can wear down our memories of tough lessons until what was once a difficult learning fades into, "This is just who I am as a person." The skill sets that make up courage are not new. They've been aspirational leadership skills for as long as there have been leaders. Yet, we haven't made great progress in developing these skills in leaders. Because we don't dig into the humanity of this work, it's too messy. It's much easier to talk about what we want and need than it is to talk about the fears, feelings, and scarcity, the belief that there's not enough, that gets in the way of achieving all of it. Basically, and perhaps ironically, we don't have the courage for real talk about courage. But it's time, and if you want to call these soft skills after you've tried putting them into practice, go for it. I dare you. Until then, find a home for your armor, and I'll see you in the arena.